Well, I have 12 o'clock on my watch here, so I think now is a good time to get started. Welcome, everybody, to the inaugural Forest Health Workshop of 2024. I am Tony Seidel, your moderator, Forest Health Program Coordinator, joined as always by our Forest Health Specialist, your host, Dr. John Ball. Today, Dr. Ball will be discussing spring training for young trees. Now, we did receive a couple of inches of snow out here in the Black Hills last night, so it might be tough to think about pruning your trees yet, but this is, I think, a well-timed topic as we start thinking about spring anyways. It'll be here soon enough. So I'm really interested to hear what Dr. Ball has to say. Looks like we have 60 people joining us. I've seen a lot of familiar names from years past. So thanks again for your continued support. Thank you to any new attendees on our workshop. We're excited to have you. Excited to share some knowledge and information with you. I kind of have a personal curiosity. I'm wondering that no one can hear me. Can anybody hear
Nope,
me?
we can hear you.
Okay. Gene, maybe you might want to check on your settings on your computer there. So I'm curious to know where everybody's coming from. We have over 60 people on most of these workshops, and I think it would be great if we could get some demographics. So if you wouldn't mind in the chat box, sometime throughout the workshop today, maybe just put in a general location that you might be calling in from. We'd really appreciate it. This workshop is being recorded. We're going to take the recording, put it on our YouTube channel, the department's YouTube channel for future references. So if you don't get all your notes taken down today, check our YouTube channel the next week. I'll make sure to put that link in our chat box as well. And with that, we do encourage participation. Dr. Ball will be chatting with us for about 45, 50 minutes, and then we should have 15 to 10 minutes for questions, a little Q&A section at the end. So again, we really appreciate everybody being here, and I'll hand it off to Dr. Ball.
All right, well, thank you, Tony, and I also welcome everyone here today. And yeah, it's snowing here in East River as well. I was West River last night and started leaving in the kind of snowy rain, and then it's snowing here on campus right now. But forecast is for us 50s in 2 weeks. So, Tony, I think spring is coming pretty soon. We just have a couple of days of this. A couple of other reminders. There will be credits for SAF, Society of American Foresters. Type in your information into the chat box, and Tony will take care of that. At the very end, we do have the CEU credits for anyone looking for ISA certified arborist credits. A reminder to everyone who is self-reporting to ISA, make sure you have the title correct, Spring Training for Young Trees. ISA gets very fussy on this, apparently, and if the title doesn't match the code, they sometimes won't really give it to you. So make sure if you're self-reporting, you provide them with the title that was submitted for the credits, Spring Training for Young Trees, and the code that I'll be putting on at the end. And that's for everyone watching today. It has to be a live presentation in order to gain the credits. All right, well, let's kick it off here, and Tony will be checking the chat box in case there's something I need to answer during it, but we will take questions at the end. But we certainly want all our trees to look good by the end here, but you got to train them to get that way. And that's why I really wanted to focus on training today. Too often in my career as an arborist, I'd be called upon to prune a real old tree, and you think if someone had properly trained it, we wouldn't have to be up to with chainsaws making very big cuts. So I'm going to go over some information today on how to properly train them, as well as a couple of other types of trees too. But I always like to start out with this. You know what? You train your puppy, you might as well train your trees, because they both need it. You want the puppy to grow up to be a pretty good dog. You'd like that young tree to actually provide all the benefits we expect from trees as they mature, rather than becoming a liability. And just a reminder, you can train a young tree to do just about anything, kind of like a puppy again. They're pretty malleable. And this is an example from Kew Gardens, but I'm not going to focus on these, but I just want to show you the ways you can train trees if you know what you're doing. So here's an espalier at Longwood Gardens in Pennsylvania, and this is actually a cypress tree that they have trained in one plane, and that's the That's what it means. You train a tree in a flat plane, usually on a wall or a trellis. Now, obviously, this takes time to do, and you have to start when the tree's young, but I've seen trees 50 feet tall, 60 feet wide, espaliered on a building side. And here's a picture I took in Amsterdam in a very small garden, but beautifully done. And notice all the linden trees. Those are linden trees that they've espaliered along the edge. Now, all those are freestanding. You notice you can get behind them as well. But you can do this to a tree if you start when they're young. And by the way, those linden trees are perfectly healthy. They've been trained since they were young to look that way. And so it does not affect their health. They're not a stress tree any more than any other tree is. Now you can do pollarding. Pollarding is where it's an art form now. It used to be done for a purpose. In other words, to grab small branches that you could use for firewood. This is out of France. And what they're doing here, southern France, you can see. But what they're doing here is they've taken these very large trees and they've trained them for several hundred years in this case, that when they got up to that high where those knobs are, that's when the branch was very small. They started cutting them there. And what they do is they always just cut back to what was called the knobs. And the trees sprout every year. They cut the sprouts back, tree sprouts again the next year. And again, this is maintained as an art form, very common in Europe. I've seen trees 700 years old that have been pollarded, for that time. Now that's quite different from, so we'll go from southern France to Selby, South Dakota, and that's topping. That's not when the branches were that small that they cut them off. Unfortunately, this was done when the trees were quite large and widespreading, and they just made very, very large cuts. So what's going to happen is you're going to get tremendous decay columns in trees like this. And is it an instant death? No. But over 15 or 20 years, you will get decline and some serious decay in these trees. So topping and pollarding are quite different. And then pleaching, that first picture where you're literally bending them over. And again, these makes wonderful walkways. And the one that most people are familiar with, topiary, where you can shear. In this case, you're looking at yews that are being sheared in these various forms. And they maintain these almost indefinitely. Very common in Europe, very common in England too, by the way, where they do a lot of this sort of work. And so my point here is not to teach these systems, but to point out just how much training you can do. So let's talk about the training we're going to try to do. And some of you may be familiar with the background there. Yes, this is campus, South Dakota State University. We try to train young minds and trees at SDSU. And I will say some trees got beyond us, so they didn't get trained properly. And I'll imagine there's a couple of students that fit that description as well. But we do the best we can with the resources we have. What you're looking at here is a fairly young hickory, shagbark hickory, a tree that I think deserves far more use in the landscape than it gets. I recognize that it's going to produce a hickory nut and when they turn about 30. So it can be, quote, a little messy to some people, but they're wonderful trees. And to me, deserve far more use than they get. But what we want to do is train these young hickories so they become very well-adjusted, mature hickories. Now, the hickory you're looking at here, this is about 10 years old. In other words, 10 years older than the first picture I showed you. Yes, they grow faster than people really think they do for about the first 30 years. But I want you to look at this tree. It has everything you want in a tree. It has a straight trunk and a terminal, not multiple terminals. And you'll notice that the larger branches on there is what we call limbs. If they're the branches attached to the trunk, we refer to it as a limb. And you'll notice the limbs are already becoming very well spaced along this. Now, by the way, once a tree reaches this height, anywhere from about 10 or in this case 15 feet, you're done training, much like your children and your dog. that if you train them when you're young, they turn out pretty good thereafter. Most of the defects we find in trees that result in failures actually occur in about that first 15 feet. And so it's not something you have to chase forever. But I wish more people would focus on having their young trees trained and less so having people have to prune, sometimes drastically, their mature trees. Most important thing, and I mentioned it right off the bat, a single stem, is that as you see here on this young hickory, it has developed what we call a double leader. You have two terminals almost of equal height. Now, when they have almost of equal height, they are competing, but the race is even. In other words, one will not lag behind the other, and they'll continue to grow equally for decades. Well, that sets up a very, very weak connection, and the tree tends to split there. And I'm sure if you go out and take a look, you don't have to walk through very far through any community, and you'll see young trees just like this that have what we call double leadered. And if all we did was remove that, it'd be a vast improvement on our future urban forest. Now, you can cut this back two ways. Where the upper arrow is, where you just cut it back so it's not as high, and that's the key, not as high. Once you reduced its height, it will not catch up. So you could cut it in half if you wanted to. You said, well, I need a branch there, a limb. So you'll cut one of those two halfway back. You could also cut it entirely, and it's really up to you whether you want a limb at that point or you don't care, so you could cut it completely off. But if there's one thing to do yet this spring, is go out in any of your small trees, those that, are 10 feet or so, something you don't have to get way up a ladder, and get them down to a single leader. But you want to do it before those stems are larger than 4 inches at the base. Beyond that, you've missed the perfect window. So, I can't overemphasize enough. You want to get out there while you're cutting material that's very small. 2 inches even better. 1 inch is perfect. So something you can cut with a hand pruner is far better than cutting something with a saw. And if you cut a limb larger than 4 inches, you are going to get some decay in there. Now, it's going to take a long time to cause a problem, but let's not set up a problem to begin with by trying to do this when they're young. Because what will happen is if you let them both go, we get what we call codominant leaders. And that's a very weak V-shaped union. And the storms we had about 10 years ago or so, Atlas, for example, the big ice storm in Sioux Falls in the spring, and then the big snowstorm in Rapid City in the fall, both those caused a lot of trees to fail. And where did they fail? They mostly failed at that union. You could see this tree split open. Sometimes they would have 3 main stems, and so it'd be split literally like a banana. And all that could have been avoided had someone gone out and done some training and got them down to a single stem, at least for about the first 10 or 15 feet. I might add too, this is equally important on your spruce trees. And I see this a lot in Sioux Falls and Brookings, Aberdeen, pick a town, Rapid City, where I was yesterday, that if you take these small trees, look at the top and you'll see a double leader again. And all you have to do, and you see the starred one I have, you don't have to cut that one off. Just cut it back. Cut it halfway. Don't even worry where you make your cut. Cut it halfway, and now you're down to a single leader. But have you ever noticed these spruce that have 2 stems, some of them coming up only within a few feet of the base? Somebody missed that training opportunity. So not only your small deciduous trees, but look around at your small spruce trees and see if they're doubling or tripling, or I've seen even quadrupling 3 or 4 or 5 main leaders coming up, all of equal heights. And that's the key. You want to make sure that one is definitely taller than the others. That will take over. That'll be the alpha stem, if you will, and will outcompete the others then once it's clearly higher than the others. Well, once you've selected the leader, the single leader, now what you want to do is try to get some good separation between adjacent limbs. And so what you want to have is at least 1 or 2 feet between limbs that are above or below one another. And so you can see in this case, we're already beginning to get that spacing there. So important for young trees that we're going to try to get about 2 feet, because these are going to get to be fairly large trees. And that original picture I showed you, notice we had some pretty good spacing among the limbs there. And you think, oh my gosh, 2 feet apart? Well, think of that. The limbs are above or below one another. And every year those limbs are going to get bigger and bigger in diameter. So starting out with a 2-foot separation, think of that 30, 40 years from now. Remember, pruning, you're not thinking of today. You're thinking of that tree decades from now. And if they're too close, let's say 6 inches that I've seen, it's not going to take very many years that those two are going to grow into each other, kind of make a stress point, and guess what? Once again, they split apart at that. And again, during the big ice storm and snowstorm, I saw a lot of damaged trees because the branches were clustered too close together. Now, and once again, you only need to do this up to about 10 feet or so. And after that, the tree's on its own. And here's one we did. You'll notice you can see the dot where the branch was cut the year before. These are some trees that my students train every spring. And this is a picture I took this last week. And you'll notice there was a branch almost, or a limb almost in between these two. And just pruned it out. And look how small that cut was. You are not going to get decay in a pruning cut that small. So this is the perfect time to do it. And there it is. You can see how quickly those close over. Well, I want to show you another example. And this is one we haven't done, but last week, as I was walking into campus, I looked at this wonderful little bur oak as a street tree, and it clearly does need some training. And now, the spring is a perfect time to do it, just before bud break, the month or so before, which we're certainly into that window now. But I want you to look at the top of this tree. Do you notice that we have a lot of upright shoots, terminals, and they're all about the same height, and we have to have one. So let me kind of zoom in on those. And the centermost one, that's straight, is the one that I would select as the main leader. Okay. And then coming just off it, and you can see it in the picture, just to the right, I made an X. I would cut that one completely off. But then I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 other limbs that are upright that are already competing or fairly close to competing. And I would cut those, but I'm only cutting them back. Take a look at the one to the left. You see how long and straight that one is? It's almost the same height as the leader. It's catching up to it. We don't want that to happen. So I would cut that long leader right back to that side branch where I put that yellow mark, and then look all the way to the right. And there's a shorter one there, but it's still upright, vigorously growing, so that'll compete. And notice where I'm going to cut that off. I'm going to just kind of reduce the tree on the sides there. And guess what? You can take off 30% of the tree when they're this young, and the tree will recover just fine. Now's the time. By that, now in the life of the tree is the time to go out there and do the heavy pruning you need to properly train it. So if this were the tree in my yard, as opposed to the street tree, I wouldn't hesitate to do all this 2 weeks from now when our temperatures are back up in the 50s and it's kind of pleasant to be outside. And I would cut that much out in a second. And now I've got it properly trained to a single leader. Well, you'll notice too, we've got the branches too close, which is normal. I mean, that's the way they come. That's why we need to train them. And so once again, I would have to make choices as to, well, now I need to have separation between adjacent branches. And I'd have to make a decision which of these two to cut. Now, you really don't get a sense of scale here, but those are really only about 1.5 inches in diameter. So when I prune one of those off, the tree barely knows it. And that's a much better time to prune them off than waiting until they're 8 or 10 inches in diameter, and that will cause serious wounding to the tree. So trim one off and you're already getting your separation. Now, the other thing you might be thinking of, though, is, John, that still has limbs fairly low for a street tree, or a boulevard tree in this case. The first permanent branch might be 8 feet off the ground. Everything below that we would call temporary. When it gets larger, going to prune it completely off because we're looking for clearance on the sidewalk too. So I'll talk to you about what do we do about temporary branches, branches that we don't really care how they look, the angle, how many. In fact, we do want to leave them on for a while because they improve the taper of the tree. They actually help the tree gain strength in terms of its form. But eventually we do need to prune them off so that we have that straight and clear trunk so that you can mow underneath it, you can walk underneath it, or if it's next to the road, so traffic can get by it. And so we'll discuss what we're going to do with those temporaries as well. But let's take a look at our tree here, and pardon my artwork, but you'll notice you've got the very top of the tree up there and say, oh, look at that. I've got a competing leader. And then I've got a limb that's turned upright, and that's also competing. Well, then you'll also notice I don't have my 1 to 2 feet of separation. So I've got some limbs that I need to remove. And I might be deciding that that limb where the arrow is at 6 to 7 feet, and that'll be my first permanent limb. Everything below that, I don't really care what it looks like because I'll be pruning that off eventually just for the clearance. So I'm going to go out there and make those cuts, and that's what I'm left with. Now, by the way, when you do this on a young tree and you say, oh my goodness, 30% of that tree is on the ground now, and you think I took too much off. Generally, no, you're fine. If the tree does produce a lot of water sprouts following this, in other words, during that summer, yeah, you may need to dial it back the next year. But I also want you to remember, training, like your puppy, is a process, not a one-time event. And so it's far better to do a little work every year for the first 10 years in its life, or every other year for the first 10 years, than to say, I'm going to do everything at 10 years and call it done. You wouldn't have much luck training a dog that way. You can't train your tree that way either. Now, notice that one that was competing, I just put it back on. Remember, you could take it completely off, as I just showed you, or you can reduce it. You can cut it back to a side branch or a bud, like I'm showing here. And you might say, well, I do want a branch there still. It's too much of a gap if I remove it. It's more than 2 feet. That's fine. As long as you clip it back to a side branch or a bud, you're fine. But this has eliminated the competition as well. And we're back to getting a pretty good looking tree. Well, those temporary limbs, I'm going to give you a very unscientific way of determining when to take them off, when they're about thumb size. How's that as a pruning gauge? And I'm not kidding. Don't take them off too quickly. Don't take them off all at once. But if you were fortunate enough to buy a tree from a nursery that had those lower branches on, you want to keep them because they develop strength for that trunk. Don't, what we call feather dust, limb them up too quickly. But when they get about thumb size, that's when you finally prune them off. And that's usually going to be probably in the first 4 or 5 years of the tree's life. You're certainly not going to have any on there close to 10 years. But that's my pruning gauge, my thumb. And on that hickory, we still have some lower branches that the mower crew's already kind of annoyed at. And they're about thumb size, so they've done their function. We'll start removing them now. And the first permanent branch on the campus is about 7 feet. So it allows people to walk underneath it and mower crews to go underneath it as well. Well, look at this one. Here's one we've been training. That is an elm. And it does have a single leader, though I understand in this picture it may not appear quite that way. But that's a discovery elm that we've been training now for about 10 years. They're fairly fast growing, and it's doing extremely well. But the reason I put this picture up there, and there's a good healthy branch, is what limbs to save and what limbs to cut. Remember, you're trying to make a decision. You've got two that are too close. One of them has to go. Which one do you leave and which one do you take off? Now, sometimes it's just preference. Well, I'll cut this one off. They both look fine. One of them has to go. But I want to give you another idea. We used to think the angle, okay, if it was an upright limb, that was weak and needed to be removed. It's not the angle. These acute angles like this are very much normal for some species, as long as they're not codominant. So in the old idea, we'd say, well, remove anything, or I was taught back in 1970, all right, more than 50 years ago. Well, if they're upright, you need to prune one of them off. Well, if you did that on an elm, you wouldn't have any branches left. They naturally are upright. So we don't use angle as a measure of the strength of the connection. What we look is its size. And here's the rule of thumb you want. Limbs should be less than half the diameter of the adjacent trunk. That is a strong limb. That's one you'd want to keep. If you said, well, John, the trunk there is 4 inches. Oh, the branch is 2 inches. That branch I want to keep. It's not competing. It's strongly attached. Has nothing to do with the angle. It's the ratio. Okay. This one you'd want to take off. And hopefully when it's rather small. But notice here, they're about the same size. That's the problem. Any limb that's more than half the diameter of the adjacent trunk is not a strong connection. Now, that doesn't mean prune them all off, but when you have to make a choice of which to keep and which to leave, you have 2 branches near each other, 2 limbs near each other, excuse me, take off the one that's bigger. And it may seem counterintuitive, but take off the one that's bigger, by that more than half the diameter of the adjacent trunk. So this one, oh yeah, I'm going to keep it. That's fairly small proportional to the trunk, healthy branch, good connection. If you wait till they get too big, they're going to tear off eventually. And it doesn't matter the angle. Look at that one. It's the same diameter as the trunk. Yes, and it's on our campus. That's a very weak connection. And by the way, it's on an adjacent tree, the one I just showed you where it tore off. So this is the sort of thing you do want to prune when they're young. But now look at this. That is about 8 inches in diameter. You prune off an 8-inch diameter limb, you are going to get decay. Now, that decay may take decades before it causes any serious harm. But pruning it off, you're going to get decay. And if we leave it on like that, you know what it's going to do? It's going to tear, as the picture of the other maple that I showed you did. And that is only, as you can probably see, about 5 feet off the ground. That is definitely something that should have been corrected. And I know these trees, these were planted in 1990, I think it was 6 or 7. So that's a 27-year-old sugar maple tree. The crew had a lot of opportunities to prune it when it was young, but they just never got to them. And nor I, so let's throw the blame on me as well. Well, I want to talk to you just a minute about some real specialty pruning. And it's quite different from the pruning we often do, and that's for fruit trees. And that'll be worthy of another lecture in itself, but I just want to show you the extremes we do for fruit trees. Now, there's the orchard I worked at in '77, and that's a Rome Beauty. That's in north of Grand Rapids, Michigan. And nobody grows their trees like that anymore because they're impossible to pick. But you know the bigger problem? You don't get good apples out of them. Because for apples, it's all about light management. On at the edge, you got great light intensity. So guess what? That'll be your biggest apples, the brightest apples, the most flavorful apples. As you get deeper in, the apples get smaller, duller. They're not as sweet until you get to the interior. They don't really color well. They don't really ripen well. They're not very flavorful. And so really, when you looked at these big apple trees, you had a shell of good apples and you had an interior of things you had to pick because you can't let them rot on the ground, but you threw out, or they went to juice market. And that, so We've changed our pruning of apple trees, and this may amaze you or horrify you. But it's all about light. You know, which side face the sun? Well, you can tell that it's B. Why? Because that's the brighter red. It's going to take longer for that other side to color. So it's all about light management. We no longer prune apple trees like that big circle. That's the worst shape for an apple tree. You either want them very tall and upright or frisbee shaped. Yeah, frisbee shaped. A two-dimensional canopy, they call them now. Now, the upright ones you can buy or make. Here's an espalier apple at McCory, but I don't know if anyone's bought these maypole apples. And by the way, they use different cultivars, but they're all called maypole apples. Why? They've already been trained to be very upright like this. And that's a picture of the apples from one of them. Look, every apple looks great. Why? Every apple is at the edge of the canopy. 8 feet tall, 3 feet wide. Tell me you couldn't put one of those in your yard. And you get fantastic apples from these trees. So if you're going through a catalog and they're selling a particular cultivar you like as a maypole apple, that's quite often what you get. Now, if you've got an apple tree that has somewhat of a rounded shape, this is what you turn them into. That's an apple orchard in Mankato. And look at the apple trees. Like I said, frisbee shape. Now I've seen some orchards, small orchards out by Rapid that have done this. And remember here, you're growing them for fruit, not for beauty, though I actually find that rather attractive too, oddly enough. But the idea is make a narrow canopy. Why? So all the apples are exposed to light. And you actually increase your production of the best apples. I took this one a couple of years ago at this time of year at Michigan State when I was passing through, and look at their apple orchard. Every one of them at about 15 feet, they've literally stubbed them there. They don't let them get any taller, and they bend all the branches. They really train all the branches to go out route like a big frisbee. And that's what they do. And they trim them that way every year to maintain that shape. And what have you done? You maximize fruit production. Now, if you don't want to do that, and I can understand not, you at least should open up your apple trees and not let them get too tall. Here's an apple tree in desperate need of some training. And this is the before, and this next picture is the after. And the dashed line shows what I've already taken off. That, once again, 1 to 2 foot separation. Now, since it's an apple tree, the first branch is going to be at 2 feet. Why? Because then I can reach down and grab the apple. And you're going to prune it back to about 8 feet on the top. In other words, once that leader gets 8 feet tall, you'll cut it off. Have it go to a side branch. And that you don't want it any taller. 8 feet's about as high as you're going to reach and pick an apple. And if you do this, you've got very good light penetration. So for apple tree training, there's really 2 points of view. The one to the left is what we call a modified leader system, where the terminal was removed when it got to about 8 to 10 feet tall. And then on the limbs, we get 1 to 2 feet of separation, with the lowest limb about 2 to 4 feet off the ground. Or you can do a frisbee. And that is the terminal is removed at about 6 to 8 feet. And if you notice, you've just got about 2 layers of limbs, still spaced about 1 to 2 feet away, and maybe a gap of about 4 feet all the way to the ground. A very open tree like that is going to really improve production. And I'll tell you this, if you ever go out to somebody's old apple tree in their yard and say, I'm not getting fruit, well, you already know why. There's not enough light penetration. But when you're standing in the center of the trunk of an apple tree and look up, you should see at least 30% sky. Now, in my frisbee tree and this other tree, you'll see 30% sky. In the big old overgrown apple or crab apple in somebody's yard, no. And you'll have to do a lot of training at a mature age now. And trees, like people, don't train well when they get old. But if you train them when they're young to look like that, you've started them out just right. And so there we go. And these are the tools you're going to use. No chainsaws, people. All you need is a nice little silky handsaw, and that is a brand. So this is not an endorsement of any particular brand, or saying anything bad about any others. There's a number of brands of these, but they all have these Japanese blades, which are a tri-blade, very sharp and easily cut, and a pair of hand pruners. Now think of this. If we got all our training done while the trees are young, we could use tools as small, make smaller cuts for the tree, whether it's an apple tree or a shade tree, and we got a healthier tree at the end. And when you're using those tools, if you're using a saw, you do want to make a thinning cut, and it's hard to illustrate on something like this, but what I want you to notice is the cut was being started right at the top. You see that little ridge line there? Just outside the ridge line, and then kind of following an opposite but equal angle down. So it actually slants out slightly. And while you can't see it here in the picture, there is a slight swollen area just to the left of that yellow dashed line, and we call that the collar. And you never want to cut into the collar. Now, the old idea was we used to flush cut. I mean, that cut went straight parallel to the trunk there. And while you'd get a nice little callus roll from it, you actually opened up the tree to decay. And so cutting at the collar, which means you start right at that union at the top, right where the ridge is, and follow that slightly enlarged area all the way down. So it'll actually be sloped out a little bit, and you made your cut just right. Ideally, too, you're making all your cuts when they're about 2 inches or smaller for the limbs. If you do it that size or smaller, you are not really introducing any decay in that tree, and that tree will recover just fine. And if you're using hand pruners, which are great tools, obviously you're making smaller cuts now, that 1/2 inch, which is even a better cut to make. Just a tip, always use the hand pruner's blade side closest so you don't leave a stub. And generally when you're holding it, you're actually cutting up. You're cutting on the underside, and you'll actually crush less tissue as you're cutting if you hold your pruners that way. So you're kind of cutting up, but always blade side closest. And on a lot of trees, you're out there the spring cutting water sprouts out. These water sprouts are these rapid growing upright shoots. You'll find them on fruit trees, crab apple trees. This is a crab apple, and you see all the water sprouts on there. Let me give you a little tip on removing water sprouts. Tip is don't remove them all at once. They'll come back with a vengeance. Maybe cut 1/3 of them out. So it takes you 3 years to do it. And water sprouts, remove them after the tree leaves out, if you can. If you wait till it leaves out and you prune them, they come back with less of a vengeance. They don't come back as strong. If you want to make a bad tree worse, go out on the next warm day on your crabapple tree, for example, cut every water sprout up, these thin, wiry, upright shoots, every one of them off. Well, you've done it during the dormant season, and you've done them all at once, and that invigorates them, and they just sprout back like crazy. Figure it's a 3-year process to start getting these under control, and you're going to do it after they leaf out, and that works fine. Now, root suckers are different. Those are actually coming from the root stock. You don't want to leave any of those. And some trees are going to produce them every year until the tree matures. Every spring, cut them all off. Now, if you want to wait till it leaves out, once again, they'll come back weaker or not as numerous. So water sprouts and suckers, I usually leave until middle of May. And then you remove them. And it doesn't mean you're not going to get some coming back. You will, but you'll get less so than if you did it now, for example, before bud break. And a little bit on this pruning too. If you've ever seen the Tinkerbell series, what they have is they've grafted a lilac. Usually I've seen Miss Kim or dwarf Korean lilacs, a number of others. They're grafted on top of a Japanese tree lilac stem. And rather than graft them at ground level, they graft them about 4 feet off the ground. You can see that here. You can see the definite line where these were grafted. Well, what that means is your understock, what we call the rootstock, is actually the tree stem up to 4 feet, and they graft them at 4 feet. So anything that comes off, any sprout that comes up off that tree lilac stem, the one with the little horizontal lintel cells, you got to prune that off every year. Don't let it wait. If you let it wait, you get that. That's a Japanese tree lilac coming up through the middle of one of these dwarf Korean lilac stems in there. And that's at a Culver's. That's actually a Culver's in Aberdeen. And I think the tree's gone now. Aaron Keys, their city forester, sent me this picture of it. But yeah, don't wait. Prune them off when you see them. And so let me end with just a couple of minutes on shrub pruning, because this is another very timely task. Not only is spring before bud break an excellent time to do a lot of your training, all these small cuts that need to be done to properly train your young trees, whether it's a fruit tree or a shade tree, but it's also a good time to prune many of your shrubs. And I'll explain that difference here in just a moment. But for shrub pruning, same tools, hand pruner, a little silky saw or another brand. Corona makes some and a number of others, and a pair of loppers. Loppers allow you to kind of cut low without having to bend over. And some of us that are old with bad backs, well, we can kind of appreciate that. But here's why. When you're pruning shrubs, unless you're making a hedge, but you're just pruning a shrub, all your cuts are made about 2 to 3 inches above the ground. All your cuts. The difference is how many you take. If you're doing rejuvenation pruning, you're cutting all the canes, shrub stems we call canes, all the canes to a height of 2 to 3 inches, and you just make a straight cut. Don't worry about an angle. If you're doing renewal pruning, you're taking about a third to maybe a fourth of the canes. And the ones you take off would be the oldest canes, the thickest canes. Now, on a lilac, you might say, well, I'm only going to take off a fifth of them or a sixth because you want to maintain maybe a 10-foot plant. Renewal pruning you do every year or about every other year. So think of it. If you take off a third every year, in 3 years, you've completely rejuvenated it in a sense. And a big lilac, it might take you 10 years to do the same thing. But what that's doing, it's always introducing new growth, which is going to be better in terms of flower production and that. And it's going to maintain flowers lower in the plant. You ever look at a lilac that hasn't been ever pruned? All the flowers are right at the very top. You don't have this nice bouquet all the way down to the base, which you would if you had proportionally younger and older and very old wood within that shrub. If you have a shrub that's out of control, then you can just rejuvenate it. Cut the whole thing to 2 to 3 inches, and if it's a healthy plant, it will come back. I've taken 15-foot tall lilacs that were healthy, just old, had not been pruned, so they're all just flowering at the top. Cut them to 2 to 3 inches, and they grow 4 feet the first year. Next year, they add another 3 feet, and they're already flowering again. So you can prune hard. So again, pardon my artwork, but there's our shrub. You know, they have multiple stems at the base. They're all sprouting up. And if I make all the cuts using a heading cut, I'm just cutting straight across. I'm not trying to cut to a side branch. And rejuvenation would be cutting them all like that. And you know where all your sprouts are going to come from? They're going to come right where you make that cut, right near the base. And so it's going to look like that. In other words, what have you done? You've maintained the natural shape of the plant. All right, that it's all coming from the base and radiating up and out. Now, that's far better than taking your shrub, cutting it back a little bit. You ever see these? Where my little black dotted line there, they ended up cutting everything at 4 feet or so. Well, you know what happens? It gets thinner and more open near the base. And all the sprouting occurs where you made your cuts. But since you made your cuts at 3 to 4 feet, all the shoots arise there. You walk through any town, you'll look at shrubs where they're very open near the base, but very thick near the top, kind of like this picture of this Contoniaster. where you can see through the bottom, but you notice at about 4 feet, you've got all these solid lines of material. That's because they keep cutting them too high. You know what I'd do if those were mine? I'd cut the whole thing to about 2 to 3 inches, let it all sprout back, and then start pruning from there as renewal pruning. Okay, last item though. If you're going to prune your shrubs, when they bloom tells you when to prune. Now, again, on your ornamental trees, we're coming up to a very nice window here where it's very pleasant to get out and work, and you can get your work done, you know, coming up into March. And same with a lot of your fruit trees. But for your shrubs, there's a little bit of a difference. If they formed their flower buds the previous summer, now you would not want to go out and prune them. Why? Because the flower buds are already set. You prune them, they're not going to flower as much. And if you do rejuvenation, they're not going to flower at all. So if you have a plant such as a forsythia or a common lilac, anything that blooms about when common lilac blooms or earlier, or if you're familiar with mock orange, same thing, a little earlier than that, you wait till right after they flower. Why? That way you get the benefits of the flowers that they've already created and see them bloom, and then you cut them. So rather than going out now, you know, or into March and prune these, you would wait until they finish blooming, which is going to be in May at some point for most of you. And then you would do your pruning. Now, the one exception of that, if you say, John, it's an overgrown, ugly shrub, I would still do rejuvenation pruning now and just figure I'm not going to get what few flowers that were going to be on it and just forfeit that, and you're fine. Now, if it's a summer flowering shrub, such as our potentillas, also known as cinquefoils, and our hydrangeas, which are another good summer flowering shrub, now's the time to do it. Why? Because all the hydrangeas you have in your yard and all the potentillas you have in your yard have not set flower buds yet. They set their flower buds the year that they bloom. So the lilac blooms you're going to see sometime in May, those buds were set last fall. The hydrangea blooms you're going to see in July, they're going to set those buds probably in June. So now we're coming up to the good time to go out there and do your pruning of the summer flowering shrubs. Spring flowering shrubs, wait until right after they bloom. One other note, there are some shrubs that do not do well by rejuvenation or renewal pruning. They're ones that look more like small trees. They only have a few main canes at the base. This is one good example. This is the purple leaf sand cherry, Prunus cystina. You cut this one back, it just looks ugly. So if you've got an out of control sand cherry, you just rip it out and plant a new one. They don't really respond to this sort of pruning at all. So with that, I think I have the critical slide for some of you. By the way, that's a sensational lilac, and it is sensational, by the way. It's a common lilac, hardy throughout the state. I think that's just as pretty as could be. But for only those that need the ISA, International Society of Arboriculture, CU credits, make sure you self-report it as spring training for young trees, and the code is DS-24-007. And a reminder to self-report as soon as possible. I know it's something to procrastinate, but ISA tends to look at those because the idea is you actually observe this live rather than record it at some point. So with that, right about where Tony said I should be. So I don't know if we have any questions. I see 47 in the chat, but I think that was responding to your original question. So Tony, I'll let you decipher if we have any questions among all your requests in there.
Yeah, sounds good. There are definitely a few questions, but I just want to say real quick, looks like we had 80 people on the call calling in from 4 different states. So all around South Dakota, which is wonderful, and even North Dakota, Nebraska, and Colorado. So thanks everybody again for joining us. We do have a few questions here, Dr. Ball. You mentioned a few metrics on how we might quantify or qualify a young tree. You talked about height, you talked about kind of the timeline, but do you have maybe a specific answer for what the age of a tree would be considered young, or when it would not be considered young? Is there a firm answer?
No, I wish there was. And because trees grow differently than we do, they can sprout back, for example. So in a sense, some parts of trees are always young. But what we really look at is, the first 10 feet. So it's going to be 10 feet tall or less. And usually a trunk diameter near the base of about 2, 3, possibly 4 inches. So if you want something of young, it would be less than a 4-inch trunk and less than about, let's call it 10 to 12 feet tall. And those trees can respond very quickly. Now, notice I didn't put an age there, but usually that's also trees that are less than 10 years old. But that's about as firm as I can give you an answer.
Sure, I understand. There's a lot of variables depending
Right.
on the site and the species. So another question we have is tree wound paint still recommended? Painting over a cut.
No, it's not. I know you can still buy it in the stores, and it's something that was an absolute in 1970. I had to carry a little paint pot with me when I climbed trees. But we've learned a lot since then. And one of the things we learned is actually trees seal off the wounds internally. In other words, you can't see that. We do see callus forming over it, which is beneficial, but it's that internal seal that is so important. We call it compartmentalizing the wound so that we don't get decay spreading out into new tissue. Now, the key thing, though, is make your cuts small. Notice I've emphasized a number of times, ideally you're making your cuts when they're 2 inches or less. Thumb size is good. Less than 4 inches, almost absolutely in your young trees. And if you do that, that wound is so small, the tree is going to be able to seal it off internally very, very easily. And so paint does not help. In fact, it actually creates a better environment for decay. So don't buy the commercial tree paint, nor go out there and slab on a little of your extra house paint on it. Make the cuts the right size at the right position, and the tree can seal it itself.
Now I see one more question in the chat. If anybody else has a question, now's your last chance to enter it. But Connie's asking, do you need to prune columnar oaks? And if so, how would you go about pruning such a variety?
Now, the columnar oaks, and they're wonderful trees. Regal Prince is one of them. Crimson Spire is one of my favorites. They're gorgeous. A couple of things with those. Sometimes we never prune the lower branches, so they look egg-shaped. So that's a tree I would say, I'm going to leave it branch to the ground so it just has that nice column. For those, they're naturally shaped in an upright position. That's almost hand pruner work, that you'd want to go out there and clip off any outward growing shoots. The other thing I would still do is try to get a little separation between adjacent limbs. And notice what I said, a little separation between adjacent limbs, because that you're typically leaving them branched fairly low. You don't want to have big openings, but I would go a foot between adjacent branches, even if I left them down to the ground. So open them up a little bit. And I would definitely do just a little bit every year. And for all our Minnesotans, if we happen to have anybody over there watching that didn't report, they're all aware of don't prune oaks in May and June. And the reason for that for the rest of you is that oak wilt, a disease that can be fatal to at least red oaks and can be a problem for the white oaks. And by that, I mean the groups. That is spread by a little insect, a picnic beetle. And that picnic beetle is attracted to fresh pruning wounds. So that's May and June, and we're talking March. So you're fine to go out there and do pruning then. But for any of our viewers in Minnesota, or may come back and watch us later on, where we do have oak wilt present, in South Dakota, it's only found a little bit in Pennington County, but otherwise has only been found occasionally in Minnehaha County. You would not want to prune those during the summertime at all.
Well, that looks like it for our questions. John, I just asked for a copy of the presentation. John, if you're listening, I'll have that, the edited version of this recording put on our YouTube channel just as quickly as possible. Usually takes a couple of days between coordinating with our IT staff and them getting the work done. I'm going to include the link to our Forest Health workshop playlist on our YouTube channel here shortly. And that's where we have all of our past workshops currently available, and feel free then to check that out in a couple of days. Certainly, I imagine by next Monday, that video should be posted, and you can use that to share with your colleagues and anybody else who has questions. Here is the link then, put it in the chat for everybody. That's how you get to our YouTube channel, and there should be 8 or 9 videos up there right now. So thanks again, everybody. I'll leave the screen up here for another minute or two if you need to grab that ISA code. Please join us next month, March. We're going to be talking about spring planting. Dr. Ball will cover everything from bare root seedlings to container grown plants. So one more step closer to our spring growing season. We're looking forward to it. Thanks again, Dr. Ball, and thanks for everybody for joining us.
Thank you for moderating, Tony, and everybody else. Happy spring. Just hunker down for the next couple of days, and hopefully spring's coming. Thanks again.